Everybody on ready to go?
Yep.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, I want to welcome everyone to an Olive Branch's webinar series on ethics in American Buddhist groups. Today's webinar is titled Leading with Values. My name is Catherine Weidman, and I'm serving as moderator for the webinar, and the webinar is being supported on the technical side by Leslie Hospodar. An Olive Branch was founded in 2011 primarily to respond to conflict and ethical misconduct that seemed to be sweeping Buddhist communities of the United States. Our organization hopes to preempt severe conflicts and misconduct by teaching dispute resolution and strengthening board governance. But in cases where conflict and misconduct are already in full bloom, we respond with processes for healing and restoring harmony. Before I introduce today's speaker, there are two things I want to mention. First, the webinar is being recorded, and the recording may be posted on the Olive Branch website. You'll be notified later if that's the case. Second, participant microphones are muted. If you have questions along the way, please enter them in the question box in the control panel of your screen, and we will hold questions until the final 10 minutes of the presentation. Questioners will not be identified by name. Today's presenter is Amber Kruk, trainer and senior project manager at the Institute for Global Ethics. The Institute provides seminars, consulting, and research to foster informed ethical decision-making for all kinds of organizations. The Institute's purpose is to encourage ethical action and help improve the ethical climate in all kinds of groups. Today, you will learn about the Institute's approach to ethical decision-making from a very engaging presenter. In addition to the biographical information on the slide, you might enjoy knowing that Amber is an experienced Appalachian Trail backpacker. She lives in central Maine with her husband, daughter, and 2 dogs. So with this brief introduction, I'll turn the presentation over to you, Amber.
Thank you, Catherine. Is everyone seeing my slides?
Yep.
Just fine? Okay, great. Well, thank you for inviting me to speak today when my colleagues and I at the Institute for Global Ethics learned about the commitment an Olive Branch has made to ethics in American Buddhist groups by offering this free webinar series. We were very excited to get involved, and I'm very pleased to be joining each of you this afternoon or this morning or evening, depending on where you're joining us from, to speak about the Institute for Global Ethics methodology. So let's get started. As Catherine mentioned, the Institute for Global Ethics is a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing practical tools to build ethical fitness and cultures of integrity at home, at school, in the workplace, and in society. To deliver on this mission, we provide a wide range of services and tools to foster informed ethical decision-making for corporations, government agencies, schools, and not-for-profit organizations. Our purpose is to encourage ethical action and help improve the ethical climate of all groups we work with. We do not seek to tell others what to think, but instead we offer tools to help individuals navigate through tough, difficult ethical issues. As an institution dedicated to the advancement of ethics, our core values establish and guide all we do. Our research suggests that 5 core ethical values are common to many cultures, regardless of race, age, religious affiliation, gender, or nationality. We will delve more deeply into this research a little later on in this webinar, but for our purposes now, to live these values, we at the Institute strive for ourselves and our clients always to be honest and truthful in all our dealings, responsible and accountable in every transaction, fair and equitable in each relationship, respectful and mindful of the dignity of every individual, compassionate and caring in each situation. We also strive to operate with a global mindset, which includes understanding differences in how ethics manifest across cultures, seeing and learning from our common ground, and fostering relationships that can operate and succeed amidst differences and complexity. Because we are dedicated to the advancement of ethics across all sectors, it is imperative that we employ a blended funding strategy. Thanks to support from foundation sponsors over the past 2 decades, the Institute has performed a range of analytical studies which have both refined our methodology and inspired new practical applications, including an increased focus on contexts and cultures that encourage individual ethical behavior. We also sustain our organization through income from our training and consulting services and support from individual donors, including corporate sponsors. This webinar is about the nature of ethics and ethical decision-making. During our time together, I will introduce you to a series of logical steps so that you can independently apply specific decision-making tools to any ethical issue you might encounter. These steps come from the Institute's Ethical Fitness Seminar, which has been organized sequentially into 4 basic sessions. Typically, at least 1 full day of instruction is recommended to adequately impart key concepts and to complete core activities for all 4 sessions. But for our purposes today, I have modified that training so that I might share with you a thorough, example-driven how-to tutorial on ethical decision-making. Our goals today are to cultivate an awareness that sound ethics is essential for survival in the 21st century, to provide a language for talking about ethics, and to encourage discussion of ethical issues, to deliver real-world experience in negotiating a set of values that reflects the group's common ethical ground, and to promote ethical fitness by providing practical tools to use in dealing with difficult dilemmas. As we move through the 21st century, the ethical issues facing the world continue to become increasingly complex, intense, widespread, and dangerous. The nonprofit, and more specifically the religious sector, is not immune from these societal changes. Board and staff members in these organizations are increasingly pressured by ethical issues. That's not surprising. One of the defining characteristics that separates nonprofits from for-profit organizations, at least in the public mind, is the focus on core values. Nonprofits are often held to higher standards of conduct than for-profits. Why? Because their mission is seen to create and sustain the moral and ethical standards of our culture, to build a better world, and to build it in better ways. Wherever values are in focus, ethical concerns play a more prominent role. Such issues arise in 2 ways. First, when individuals depart from their core values and do something unethical. Ethics is seen to be a question of right versus wrong. When core values come into conflict and produce tough choices between 2 right courses of actions, ethics becomes a matter of right versus right. These 2 models play themselves out in 2 familiar ways to nearly every nonprofit staff and board member. First, because nonprofits have a responsibility to do things right, they must constantly be vigilant to the right versus wrong situations, making sure they were always acting on the side of right. Second, because nonprofits have an obligation to do the right things, often making wrenching choices among competing priorities and having to ask what choice best fits their mission. They must develop methodologies for analyzing and resolving right versus right dilemmas. An exploration of the second obligation and the need for clear, robust decision-making that surrounds it lies at the heart of today's webinar. Ask yourself, what are the issues we see every day in the newspapers and on television? We see children who are increasingly violent in the streets and in schools, parents who abuse and neglect their children, business people who downsize their workforce and then accept a bonus for doing so, media devoted to sensationalizing whatever they can, and so on. Each of these problems is driven, at least partly, by the unethical behavior of individuals. And the media has played an important role in feeding the public cynicism about the state of ethics in our world today. And knowledge that the world is watching has magnified the focus on ethics. But what do we mean when we say ethics? The dictionary defines ethics as a discipline dealing with what is good and bad and with moral duty and obligation. I think it's fair to say that when we hear people talk about ethics in the media or in a professional setting, most are commonly referring to ethics in terms of right versus wrong, or issues relating to moral temptations and professional responsibility. At the Institute for Global Ethics, while we believe that it is critical to train people in being able to recognize the difference between issues of right and wrong, those are not the issues that cause you to stay awake at night. Therefore, we define ethics as matters of right versus right, or ethical dilemmas, situations pitting two right principles against each other. You might also hear us refer to it as obedience to the unenforceable, a phrase coined by the 19th century British jurist Lord Moulton. The phrase was crafted to capture the concept of a domain where neither law nor absolute freedom rules. Unfortunately, we can easily recognize how the law steps in to fill the void when ethical behavior is not commonly upheld. In the 1950s, for instance, there were no road signs saying, "Do not litter," or $200 fine for littering. That's because people just didn't do those kinds of things. Today they do, evidently, because littering is regulated just about everywhere. What follows next are concrete steps to help guide individuals through the gray areas of ethical decision-making. So let's explore what are ethical values. There are values of all kinds that help us make choices about what to eat, where to live, what music to buy, and so on. These values might be culinary, aesthetic, or financial. When we make choices about how to behave or how to treat others, we will be applying ethical values. Ethical values are positive and help describe the ideal human character. They are a principle, standard, or quality that is intrinsically worthwhile. They are good unto themselves. Ethical values are the bedrock of ethics, the very stones that are the foundation of civilization. And just as important, they are easily understood. They're not overarching. We have students in kindergarten who can understand what shared ethical values are because they are so fundamental. Shared values are more than just lists of words hung on walls. They are operative beliefs that people believe, that people of any description can apply in their labor toward a common vision. For more than 20 years, the Institute for Global Ethics has surveyed thousands of people worldwide, conducted focus groups, and worked with organizations to define sets of core shared moral values. Sometimes these value sets become codes of ethics. Not surprisingly, the important values chosen by people everywhere tend to look rather similar. Even when the value definition exercise is conducted in a language other than English. 5 values have typically dominated the landscape: honesty, responsibility, respect, fairness, and compassion. Creating a code by seeking and listing the values is not enough. The sincere organization will request that employees at all levels decide how to apply those values in their everyday activities. They will look at how the values will affect planning and strategy setting. The values will also function as analytical tools in making mission decisions and in setting policy for personnel. Most authorities agree that successful codes of ethics are general and not detailed, brief and easily memorized, statements of shared basic values, positive terms that describe attitudes and behaviors. However, creating a list of fundamental shared values is your organization's critical first step. The Buddhist religion has well-established precepts, its code. And to connect the meaning of these values to the day-to-day activity of your organization, you have to operationalize them. Ask, what does it mean for a Buddhist to be responsible. How does the Sangha staff demonstrate compassion? When every person connected to your code has thought about applying the precepts to their duties and interactions, the code is well on its way to being an authentic part of your organization's fabric. A code of ethics, a solid set of values, is a great start, but ethics is really about decision-making. The most difficult ethical decision is a dilemma, a balanced choice between two equal principles. But are all ethical decisions dilemmas? The first step in ethical decision-making is to determine whether you have a right versus right ethical dilemma or a right versus wrong moral temptation. Most people faced with a choice between right and wrong will choose to do the right thing. However, sometimes we're tempted to do wrong. Why would someone be tempted to do wrong? Why, for example, would a person inflate an insurance claim? Would a citizen not report all income on her tax return? Would a salesman promise to deliver on a product by a certain date, even though it probably wouldn't be ready then? Right versus wrong decisions really are not ethical dilemmas as we define them. They are simply decisions in which we are tempted to do what we know is not right. To test whether a decision you are about to make concerns right versus wrong, try applying the following 6 tests. Your choice is wrong if it doesn't pass any of the 6 tests, and probably wrong if it doesn't pass at least 2 of them. So let's explore the 6 ways to tell right from wrong. First up is the legal test. Ask yourself, is the choice I'm about to make against the law? It is wrong, we say, to steal something without paying for it, refuse to pay rent, or abuse your children. Although you may break a law on purpose or by mistake, in our society, we say it is wrong to break the law. Next is the professional standards test. Ask yourself, is this choice consistent with standards of conduct promulgated by your profession? If you were to make this choice in the presence of your colleagues, what would they say or do? Third is the gut feeling test. Does this choice smell? Does it feel wrong and deep within your gut? Often our intuition can select right from wrong even before our brains can think it through. If a decision causes you to have a bad gut reaction, then perhaps you should think more about it before acting. Fourth is the front page test. How would you feel if your decision were headlined on the front page of a local newspaper or in the online edition? In imagining this, you are holding up your choice to be seen by everyone you know. What would your family think? What would your friends think? How would everyone else in your community react? Next is the role model test. Think of a person you respect highly, someone who models the values you have selected for your list of qualities that define a good person. If this person had to make the decision you are about to make, what would he or she do? Finally is the core values test. Does this choice conflict with one of your core values? Your values are usually your front line of defense against right versus wrong situations. If the decision calls for you to suspend your values, you need to watch out. But what if your decision is more complex and more difficult than simple right versus wrong? Do both choices appear right and good? Does it appear to be a conflict of your core values? If all of these are true, maybe you have an ethical dilemma. So let's begin to explore what to do if you're faced with an ethical dilemma. All of us face tough choices. Sometimes we duck them, sometimes we address them. Even when we do address them, however, we do not always decide to resolve them. Sometimes we simply brood endlessly over possible outcomes or agonize about paths to pursue. And even when we do try to resolve them, we do not always do so by energetic self-reflection. Sometimes we simply bull our way through to a conclusion by sheer impatience and assertive self-will, as though getting it resolved were more important than getting it right. But what about those who seek to address and resolve tough choices through principled analysis? There is a place for those who want to address and resolve tough choices through energetic self-reflection. Those are the people, after all, whom we often think of as good people. They are good, we say, because they seem to have some conscious sense of vision, some deep core of ethical values that gives them the courage to stand up to the tough choices. That does not mean they face fewer tough choices than other people. Quite the opposite. Those who live in close proximity to their basic values are apt to agonize over choices that other people drifting over the surface of their lives might never even see as problems. Sound values raise tough choices, and tough choices typically are those that pit one right value against another. That's true in every walk of life, voluntary, corporate, professional, personal, civic, international, educational, religious, and the rest. Consider that it is right to protect the endangered spotted owl in the old growth forests of the U.S. Northwest, and right to provide jobs for loggers. It is right on the one hand to honor a woman's right to make choices affecting her body, and right to protect the lives of the unborn. It is right to extend equal social services to everyone, regardless of race or ethnic origin, and right to pay special attention to those whose cultural backgrounds may have deprived them from past opportunities. It's right on the one hand to throw the book at good employees who make dumb decisions that endanger the organization. And it's right on the other hand to have enough compassion to give them another chance. So how can we deal with moral dilemmas that pit one deeply held value against another? In genuine right versus right dilemmas, each side is firmly rooted in one of our basic core values. Four such dilemmas appear to be so fundamental to the right versus right choices all of us face that they can be rightly called dilemma paradigms. They are truth versus loyalty, individual versus community, short-term versus long-term, and justice versus mercy. Their names are less important than the ideas they reflect, whether you call it law versus love, or equity versus compassion, or fairness versus affection. You're talking about some form of justice versus mercy. Yet while the names may be flexible, the concepts are not. In the past 25 years, our staff and trainers have listened to thousands of ethical dilemmas that have been told in our seminars. But the Institute has found that generally, they fit into one or more of the four paradigms. But merely to analyze a dilemma, even to fit it into one of these paradigms, is not to resolve it. Resolution requires us to choose which side is the nearest or highest right for the circumstances, and that requires principles for decision-making. I will briefly outline three principles drawn from the traditions of moral philosophy. Of the many theories, these represent three that are useful in helping us think through right versus right issues. And these are the three that are probably going to take you back to your Ethics 101 course that you took in college or high school or postgraduate work. Each gives us a way to test the twin rights of a dilemma. First up, end-space thinking. Known to philosophers as utilitarianism, this principle is best known by the maxim, do whatever produces the greatest good for the greatest number. It demands of us a kind of cost-benefit analysis, determining who will be hurt and who helped by measuring the intensity of that help. It is the staple of public policy debate. Most legislation these days is crafted with the utilitarian test in mind. Next up is rule-based thinking, often associated with the name of the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. This principle is best known by what Kant sometimes somewhat obtusely called the categorical imperative. Kant put it this way, act only on that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become universal law. Or more simply put, that means follow only the principle that you would want everyone else to follow. Lastly, is arguably the most widely understood principle, the principle of care-based thinking. This third principle, putting love for others first, comes into play most frequently in the Golden Rule. Do unto others what you would like them to do to you. In other words, It asks you to test your actions by putting yourself in another's shoes and imagining how it would feel if you were the recipient rather than the perpetrator of your actions. Often associated with Christianity, Jesus, after all, said, "All things whatsoever ye would that men should do to you, do ye even so to them." It is in fact so universal that it appears at the center of every one of the world's great religious teachings. These three principles are simply lenses to help you filter through the dilemma you're faced with. Dilemmas are personal, and even when you're using the stepped approach, we all might choose differently. So let's explore how these principles apply by considering an example based on real-life experience of one of our seminar participants. We've changed the names of the people involved to protect their privacy. This is Jill, and Jill has a dilemma. Jill has accepted responsibility for starting up a resident-driven housing program, part of an economic development organization that was already making headlines. Although she faced a long list of complex decisions, she could count on years of practical experience and knowledge to help her make them. One of the many important preliminary tasks was to organize staffing for the program and choose the best candidates. She had hired a local consultant named Ruben Noyes to assemble a list of candidates for the open positions. He had insisted on checking references, which he did exhaustively. When Ruben presented the candidates, along with comments from references, Jill was pleased to see a wide range of experience, education, skill sets, and professionalism. Some of the candidates were even from the same environment as residents for the proposed housing program. She and Ruben reviewed each candidate and discussed qualifications, including essential skills such as communication, teamwork, willingness to learn, dependability, and more. Quickly, the list was winnowed to one or two people for each position. However, one person who was a top candidate for the transportation position grew gentle resistance from Ruben. His contacts outside the formal list of references had noted some undeclared baggage associated with the candidate, Archie Johnson. Ruben categorized Archie as a wild young man. He shared that Archie had been a troublemaker in other jobs and is tough to work with. Jill pointed out that Archie knows transportation from the ground up. He was actually a bus driver in the neighborhood and grew up around where the housing program would be established. He has good technical skills and shares the same ethnic culture as most of the program's future population. Ruben and Jill grew up on the same side of the tracks and understand how important it can be for a project worker's credibility if he or she has the same background of the residents of the neighborhood. Ruben, however, remains unconvinced, and he thinks it's dangerous to throw a prickly, abrasive person into a brand new team and suggests that they revisit hiring Archie after the team is up and running the office, after the team is up and running and the office culture has been established. Jill feels strongly that they are there to help people climb the ladder, to do better for themselves than they could without help. And she wonders if that alone should be the reason they take a chance on Archie. Ruben tries once more to convince Jill not to take a chance on Archie. Matter-of-factly, he says, "You've never been a gambler. Why start with something as important as a housing development?" Jill knew from bitter experience that it only takes one troublesome employee to really scramble an otherwise effective project team. Jill has a problem. Archie. Should she hire him? On the one hand, he's a solid candidate for the transportation coordinator. He's got the skills, knowledge, and background. And hiring him would help Jill fulfill her organization's mission to provide opportunities for the Archies of the world. And on the other hand, Archie might spell disaster for the harmony in the new programs office. He might offend some employees, set others into conflict, and even be the cause of public relations nightmares. Moreover, Archie may have learned the nuts and bolts of the transportation system, but would he have the perspective to create and manage a new, intricate, and integral part of the program? Jill's challenge might be expressed best under the two paradigms, individual versus community and justice versus mercy. Whereas it is clearly right from Jill's perspective to champion the cause of a deserving individual by offering the job to Archie. It is also right to protect the community of office workers in the new program and the wider community of program residents from a difficult personality. It's right to be merciful by extending a second chance to someone who made a few mistakes in the past. But Jill can make an equally good case that the best answer is to be just by denying an opportunity to a proven troublemaker. It's still a dilemma, but its shape is more clearly defined now that we use the dilemma paradigms. The ends-based principle, finding the greatest good for the greatest number, might have Jill looking for an employee who had proven to be a good team player, someone who will be an asset to office harmony rather than a potential liability. The rule-based principle, attempting to establish a maxim in this decision by reaching for the highest right, would lead Jill to hire Archie. It's her mission to raise people up, and this is a great second chance for Archie. The care-based approach of reversibility, what would Archie do if he were in her place, is pretty obvious. Archie would want to be hired. Jill is both practical and hopeful. She wants the program to succeed under the leadership of its staff, and she'd like to fill that position with someone who really needs the opportunity. But what should she do? Next, we would advise Jill to consider if there's a third way out, what we call a trilemma option, that allows for a compromise between two rights. If you remember, Reuben presented Jill with a trilemma option when he suggested waiting to hire Archie until after the office culture had been established. It is important to remember that this is a process. It is not a mathematical formula for which everyone will arrive at the same conclusion. It is a series of steps that provide individuals the tools to sort out what they are up against. In the end, the choice is Jill's to make. So let's do a quick recap and review each of the 9 steps, or what we call the 9 checkpoints for ethical decision making. The first step is to recognize that there is a moral issue. This step requires us to identify issues needing attention. Rather than to brush past them without another look, it requires us to sift genuinely moral questions from those that merely involve manners and social conventions, or that take us into realms of conflicting values that are not so much moral as economic, technological, or aesthetic. Next, you need to determine who the actor is. Ask yourself, whose dilemma is this? If the issue is a moral one, is it mine? Whose is it? The question is not whether I am involved, but whether I am responsible, whether I am morally obligated and empowered to do anything in the face of the moral issues raised. Next, you need to gather the relevant facts. Not to know the way events unfolded, what finally happened, and who else might have happened, and what else might have happened, who said what to whom, who may have suppressed information, or who was culpably ignorant or innocently unaware, leaves crucial voids in understanding. If Reuben hadn't been so determined to do an exhaustive reference search, Jill may never have had a dilemma, because they wouldn't have found out Archie's past indiscretions. Next, go back to the 6 tests for right versus wrong. Is law breaking involved? If so, it is a legal rather than moral matter. If the answer to the legal test is less obvious, begin using the remaining 5 tests to assess if you are facing an ethical dilemma. Then begin testing for your dilemma against the right versus right paradigms. You need to find out what sort of dilemma is this. Is this truth versus loyalty, self versus community, short-term versus long-term, or justice versus mercy? The point is to bring sharply into focus the fact that it is indeed a genuine dilemma, in that it pits two deeply held core ethical values against each other. If you're struggling to fit your challenge, your dilemma, into one of the paradigms, you might need to go back to step 4 and really work it through the test for wrong again. If it really doesn't seem wrong, then come back to the dilemma paradigms and test it again. You really want to be sure that what you're up against is right versus right. So if you have any question, just go back to the step before and repeat. Next, if you're certain you have an ethical dilemma, start applying the resolution principles. And the 3 resolution principles can be brought to bear once you have the choice between the two sides clearly articulated. The ends-based or utilitarian principle, the rules-based or Kantian principle, and the cares-based principle or the golden rule. The goal is to locate a line of reasoning that seems most relevant to the issue at hand. Next is the trilemma option. This step can kick into action at any point throughout the process, so we put it here in case you're not sure what to do after you've worked it through the 3 principles. It asks, is there a third way through? Sometimes that middle ground will result in a compromise between 2 rights. Next up, you have to make the decision. This step, surprisingly, is sometimes overlooked. Perhaps that is because the intellectual wrestling required in the previous steps can seem exhaustive, leaving little energy for the final decision. And finally, revisit and reflect on the decision. When the tumult and shouting have died, go back over the process and seek its lessons. This feedback loop builds expertise and helps us adjust our moral compass. I'd like to leave you with one parting thought. Practice, practice, practice. Sometimes it takes moral courage to make and act on tough ethical decisions. Being morally courageous is part of being ethically fit. If you have to practice, you have to practice doing the right thing if you're going to become good at it. Sorry if I've raced through this, but I want to thank you for spending the better part of the last hour with me exploring the Institute's ethical decision-making model. For those of you who have questions, we have a little time now to explore, and I invite you to chat your questions in at this time.
Thank you, Amber. This is Catherine. We have one question up before us at the moment, and that is the presentation seems to focus on individual ethical decision-making. What advice do you have for group ethical decision-making as in a board of directors, for example?
Good question. So our focus is on individual decision-making because any organization or group is comprised of individuals. But what we like to do with boards or other groups is to put practices in place. So if you have a decision to make, you all work through that decision through the same process, but you develop a group process for how these decisions are negotiated. Because I pointed out, this isn't a mathematical process. You might have 10 people on your board and different ways to resolve this, whatever decision you're up against. So it's really about finding the application that's going to suit your group. And we don't have off-the-shelf solutions. You know, we work with individual groups on looking at their context, their culture, and thinking about what makes the best sense for a group decision-making approach. It is actually a line of research we'd like to pursue in the future. We haven't done any statistically significant studies into group decision-making. Our process, as you picked up, is very, very focused on the individual, and where we're focused now is on working with groups on harnessing that individual decision making and putting the conditions in place so that those individuals can make good choices, and finding those practices and tools and policies that would support that good decision making. So I'm not sure that that answers your question, and I'm happy to respond to a follow-up if it didn't.
Well, as you've been explaining the group process, it occurs to me that this isn't part of the question. This is just me now asking. It's entirely feasible that different, let's say, board members, for example, could have quite different weight that they put on the, what are they called, the right versus right values, justice and mercy.
Mercy.
Right?
Yes.
And get into quite a protracted conflict over whose value is the right value. Do you have any thoughts of resolving conflict when people have rather entrenched positions on in two right values?
Yeah. So I think the first stop is that we need to be respectful of each other and understand that, you know, we're coming from a place of shared values. We all agree that we believe in these shared values, and that it's equally right to be honest, fair, responsible, respectful, and compassionate. So the starting point is to recognize that just because you didn't reach the same conclusion doesn't mean that there isn't right on both sides. Some people are still very black and white with our process, and it takes a lot of practice with the process. And it takes that last step, that step number 9, to revisit and reflect on your decisions, because as you start a journal, let's say, where you're tracking your decisions, you start to notice some of your own bad habits in terms of, I really am, you know, very merciful. I'm always siding with mercy with my 6-year-old daughter and looking for an opportunity to give her a second chance. So I'm working to get over on the side of justice more often with her and just laying down the law. So we also have to look internally and inwardly at our natural prejudices, whether we knowingly do that or we just inherently act in a certain way. So unfortunately, some of the onus is on the individual to take a look at how they're coming to their decisions. And then once they've done that reflection, if they still fall on the other side, you know, someone decides that they need to show mercy and someone decides that they need to show justice, we have to accept that those are two right choices. Again, in the same setting of you're a board and you're making a decision, unfortunately it falls back to board policy. If the board policy states 2/3 majority rules, then that might be the mechanism that resolves it. And people need to, you know, respect the process and respect that this came from a place of shared values that was agreed upon, and that they worked their way through the process and reached a different conclusion. Does that help?
Yes, thank you. At the moment, we don't have any other questions, so if any of the participants have something they've been considering, please go ahead and enter it in the control panel box that's on your screen. And in the meantime, while people do that, Amber, let me ask you if you will field questions individually that are sent to you at your email address there that's on the slide.
Yes, absolutely. If you aren't ready to ask a question and need to think on this a little bit, then please go right ahead and take note of my email address and feel free to reach out to me directly. I'm happy to get back to you with a response, and perhaps I have some tools that I can send along to you that would be helpful.
Okay, thank you. Well, at that point then, I'm not seeing any further questions come in. Let's go ahead and draw the webinar to a close. So are you seeing my thank you for participating slide?
We are.
Okay, thank you. So I'd like to note that if you have benefited from this webinar and would like to be more informed regarding ethical decision making, of course you can contact our presenter, Amber. I can also highly recommend Rushworth Kidder's book, How Good People Make Tough Decisions, or Tough Choices, Resolving the Dilemmas of Ethical Living. Rushworth Kidder was the founder of the Institute for Global Ethics. And so then on behalf of us at an Olive Branch, I want to thank you, Amber, for today's presentation, and also thank the participants and ask that you complete a questionnaire that will appear in your inbox shortly. Our next webinar is set for Tuesday, May 5th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, 11 p.m. Pacific Time, 11 a.m. Pacific Time. It's the last webinar in our series on ethics in U.S. Buddhist groups, and it will bring together key elements of the previous 3 webinars. The speakers will present and discuss a framework for good governance practices that reduce the incidence and severity of conflict, and a method for handling conflict effectively when it arises. The session will include discussion topics or questions that are submitted in advance, and you can see Leslie's email address there. We will be sending a flyer with the information and the registration link. So thank you once again for attending an Olive Branch's 3rd webinar on ethics in American Buddhist groups. We hope you will register for the next session. And have a good day.